About 25 years ago, I wrote a chapter in a book on Roosevelt and the Holocaust. I was young then. I did the best I could. I thought it was decent, but at the end of it I said, I didn't really get to the bottom of a very complicated man. I just didn't know how to do any better because of a dearth of good sources. Franklin Roosevelt did not make it easy for historians. He did not keep a diary. He did not write lots of long personal letters as president. He did not write lots of long government memoranda. He did not permit official cabinet minutes. He loved to talk to people in private conversations. And during those conversations, he did not permit others to take notes. My wife wants me to say he also did not permit tweets. So Roosevelt is hard to get at, particularly on sensitive topics. And to make matters worse, Roosevelt loved to tell people what they wanted to hear. So in a conversation with a Zionist, he could sound like a Zionist. In a conversation with an anti-Semite, he could sound like an anti-Semite. I kept my eye on Franklin Roosevelt over the years to see if better sources emerged. In the 1990s, the family of Sumner Welles donated the Welles papers to the Roosevelt Library. Sumner Welles was the Undersecretary of State, the number 2 man in the State Department. But even more important than that, he was Roosevelt's man in the State Department. And because he kept good records, the Welles papers were really, really important for anyone looking at Roosevelt and the period before and during the war. But that wasn't quite enough for me to drop everything else and run to Hyde Park. I was busy with some other things. And one of the other things was a project to publish the diaries and papers of a man named James G. McDonald. Has anyone heard of James G. McDonald? I'm not surprised. He is probably best known as the first American ambassador to Israel. But before that, he was League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from 1933 to 1935. And he served a chair of President Roosevelt's Advisory Committee on Political Refugees from 1938 to 1945. McDonald kept a diary part of the time. We were committed. I was brought in to be lead editor of a project to publish this for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And we were committed to publishing a series of volumes from the diary and his papers. Well, the problem was there was a big hole in the middle. Between 1936 and the end of the war, he didn't keep a diary. So we decided to create a diary-like volume by drawing upon his letters and papers, by drawing upon other people's diaries, by drawing upon government documents, so that this volume would look much the same as the first volume or the third volume. We had to do an awful lot of digging. In the course of that research, we turned up the fact that a friend of McDonald's, a man by the name of Arthur Sweetser, who worked for the League of Nations, had a conversation with Franklin Roosevelt in April 1938. I asked one of the other editors to go look at the Sweetser papers and see if Sweetser happened to write about his conversation with Franklin Roosevelt. And we found a 6-page single-spaced document in which Sweetser, shortly afterwards, reconstructed that conversation. With Roosevelt, you pay attention, particularly when Roosevelt said something that his audience didn't want to hear. What Sweetser wanted to hear was that the United States would do more in cooperation with the League of Nations. What Roosevelt wanted to talk about was his efforts on refugees. This was April 1938. Before the war, just after Germany had taken over Austria. Roosevelt told Sweetser he wanted to get all the Jews out of Europe before there was war. Well, I knew Roosevelt was different at different times, but I never knew that he was that different. And it was at that point that I said, I've got to go back and do a book on Roosevelt. At first I thought I would do a book on Roosevelt and the Holocaust. But when I asked around the publishing world, I was told, everybody thinks that's already done. And I said, yes, there are some books on it, but they're either not very good or they're not very much on Franklin Roosevelt. And the answer I got was, it doesn't matter. The publishers all think it's been done, and it's going to be hard to change their minds. But what about doing a book on Roosevelt from birth to death? A book on his relations with American Jews, as well as his dealing with European Jews. And I said, oy, that's 10 years. And then I thought, and one of my colleagues and friends is a wonderful American political historian, and I went to Alan and I said, would you do this with me? And so it only took us 5 years. So it was one key document of what we call the second Roosevelt that brought about this book. And let me explain that this was not a one-off. This was not a one-time event. Let me try to explain in the time remaining a portion of the second Franklin Roosevelt. In 1936, Franklin Roosevelt was reelected by a landslide. He could boast of a wonderful record of accomplishment in domestic policy. We still benefit from some of the programs that Roosevelt called the New Deal. Social Security is probably the best known among them. In foreign policy, he had done virtually nothing. He could hardly do much as Europe seemed to be going from bad to worse, and as Congress seemed to be committed to tying his hands as much as possible. And to be fair, Congress reflected the majority sentiment among the American people. The country was largely isolationist. Many Americans had come to the conclusion that American participation in the First World War was a mistake. So what could Roosevelt do in foreign policy? One interesting step signaled the future direction. 2 weeks after his reelection, the State Department sent out a new instruction to American consuls in Europe and in Germany in particular. The United States had an immigration law based on quotas. The quotas had been set in the 1920s. That's another story. You can ask me about it if you want afterwards. The quota for Germany happened to be substantial. It was 25,957. But from 1930 on, it had never been filled because the State Department, under pressure from President Hoover, had decided to use an obscure provision of immigration law called the Public Charge Clause. Anyone likely to become a public charge was ineligible for a visa. Things changed a little bit when Roosevelt was elected in 1933, but not very much. The State Department remained committed to enforcing that clause. And so most of the quota from 1933 until 1936 was not used. But in November 1936, right after re-election, the consuls in Germany were told that they were not supposed to be eliminating people who might conceivably become public charges, only those who were likely to become public charges. And many German and Austrian Jews had relatives in the United States who were sincerely concerned about their welfare. And what do you think happened? Suddenly, immigration visas doubled within a year. That was 1937. Then came 1938. Of course, we know the big political events of 1938. As Nazi Germany became more aggressive, it took over Austria and then a slice of Czechoslovakia. But even before that, there were signs of a coming war. On January 22nd, 1938, Roosevelt had a meeting with Rabbi Stephen Wise, the head of the American Jewish Congress and probably the most famous American Jewish leader of the day. Roosevelt suggested that the situation of Jews in Europe was difficult and was liable to get more difficult. Jews might want to seek other areas to move to. Wise was a Zionist. He wanted to focus on Palestine. Wise said, Palestine is the Jewish homeland. Roosevelt said, the possibilities of Palestine may be exhausted. You need another card up your sleeve. Did Roosevelt anticipate the Holocaust? No. But Roosevelt anticipated the fact that war was going to make the situation of Jews in Europe even more difficult than it already was. He had a sense that national, ethnic, and religious minorities were not well liked in a number of Eastern European countries, and Nazi Germany was kind of a special case of near disaster. And if you look at some of the most recent literature, particularly I'm thinking of a book by Bernard Wasserstein called On the Eve, the Jews of Europe Before the Second World War, you will also see a quite dark picture, to the point that in addition to Zionists, there were some Jews who pushed for what Roosevelt was pushing for, a kind of Jewish territorialism outside of Palestine. It was a small movement, but it was indicative of a sense of danger and a sense that Palestine was, partly because of artificial restrictions and partly because of economic factors, Palestine was not going to be able to accommodate all. So that was January of 1938. And then in March, Germany took over Austria, and Roosevelt had a cabinet meeting about the Austrian situation. I said there were no cabinet minutes, but we have two cabinet members who kept diaries and wrote about what happened at that meeting. Roosevelt raised the issue of what could be done. Nazi Germany was now suddenly persecuting in humiliating ways about 200,000 Austrian Jews who had up until then been exempt. Roosevelt said, could we combine the quota for Germany, which was pretty large, with the quota for Austria? And he got some advice yes and some advice no. And then he said, could we go beyond the quota? And the answer was not without going to Congress. And the vice president said, if Congress could vote on this, if they could vote in secret, they would vote to ban all immigration. So Roosevelt decided not to go to Congress. The two quotas were combined. From that point on, 27,300 plus could leave Germany and immigrate to the United States, provided they were judged not likely to become public charges. And the administration signaled that the full quota would be used. But Roosevelt wasn't done, because that obviously was not going to deal with the large majority of German and Austrian Jews and others who might want to leave. And so he began an international effort to persuade other countries to take in what he called his preferred term, political refugees. He was once asked about that, because the implication was most of these people were Jewish. And the State Department came back with the answer, I think it was Wells, that these people were refugees because of political conditions in the countries in which they lived. But in fact, he was avoiding the term Jewish refugees because of the level of anti-Semitism in the United States and in other countries. So some of you who've studied the subject know that there was, in fact, an international conference on refugees held in France in July of 1938. It is called the Evian Conference, after the resort town where it was held. As one sharp-witted observer said at the time, Evian spelled backwards is naive. Country after country got up and said that it was not a country of immigration, and although it probably could use some people here and there, it needed farmers rather than professionals or intellectuals. Some of them were very blunt and said they didn't need Jewish immigrants. So it did not satisfy the broad hopes for resettling very large numbers numbers of Jews from Germany and Austria. But the conference did set up a new organization called the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. And this organization was given the task of bargaining with Nazi Germany to let more people out. Because these negotiations failed, many historians have been scornful about the overall effort. But I think this is probably using a bit too much hindsight. Nazi Germany, in the middle of 1938, had a policy of pushing Jews out. It was not yet planning to exterminate the entire Jewish population of Europe. And it was by no means clear that Germany would refuse to cooperate with a plan to remove Jews. And so it was worth exploring negotiations. The Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees eventually found that Germany was more committed to punishing Jews and to robbing Jews than it was to finding places abroad for them. And so Jews were not allowed to take very many assets with them, and therefore they found it hard to convince a number of other countries that they would be economic assets rather than liabilities. Still, these negotiations continued well into the spring of 1939. There were hopes and dashed hopes, and new hopes and dashed hopes. Meanwhile, Sumner Welles, Roosevelt's man in the State Department, tried to make the case domestically and with other countries that they should cooperate in this program. Domestically, Welles, Roosevelt's man, argued that the Jewish problem was such an irritant to Germany that it added to the pressures for war. And if the Jewish question, if Germany's so-called Jewish question could be resolved, it might help to prevent or delay war. That was a line that isolationists might accept. And abroad, Welles argued that other countries, particularly those with plenty of land or a dearth of professionals, could benefit economically and socially from the addition of large numbers of Jews. Shortly after the Night of Broken Glass in November 1938, the famous, infamous pogrom, Welles sent out a top priority cable to all of the American ambassadors to all of the Latin American countries, asking them to meet personally with the foreign ministers of those countries and stress to them that the United States was sincerely concerned about political refugees in Central Europe and suggesting that they would earn American goodwill by participating in a resettlement program. This effort failed more often than it succeeded, but it didn't fail everywhere. At the Evian conference, the one country that stood up and said it was willing to take Jews in fact promising that it might accept 100,000 Jews, was the Dominican Republic. That effort turned out to be a kind of tragic comedy, and in the end, fewer than 1,000 refugees made it to the Dominican Republic. But the story that people don't generally know is that of Bolivia. Bolivia, partly because it hoped to earn the goodwill of the United States, and partly because there was a powerful German Jewish industrialist there with political influence. Bolivia gave visas to at least 20,000 Jews from Germany and Austria in the period 1938 to 1941. That's not hundreds of thousands of people, but that's a substantial number, making Bolivia the largest rescuer per capita in the world. By the beginning of 1939, the waiting list for visas to the United States in Germany was about 300,000. The hope was that people could get out somewhere and wait their turn for visas to the United States. The United States was only under law allowed to take in 27,300 plus per year. So one option came about in Cuba. The Cuba story is, for most people, summed up with the now famous story of the SS St. Louis. I'm going to ask, what happened to the passengers of the SS St. Louis? They were sent back to Germany. Okay. The answer was they were sent back to Germany. Now I'm going to tell you the real story. The real story began in November 1938. 2 days after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Franklin Roosevelt met with a man named Fulgencio Batista in the White House. Batista was the strongman in Cuba, not yet the dictator, but the head of the military. Batista wanted to improve his image in the United States and to get a reduction in the American tariff on Cuban sugar. We don't have a record of the conversation among Roosevelt, Wells, and Batista. But we do have a record of what happened after that meeting. Batista went to New York. He gave a speech in New York in which he said he was very pleased to be cooperating with President Roosevelt in his effort to do something about the terrible situation of refugees in Central Europe. And a columnist for the Washington Post wrote an article about how Batista was delaying his return to Cuba in order to work out a plan to accommodate political refugees. From November 1938 until May 1939, ship after ship left German ports with Jewish refugees destined for Cuba, possessing what they call tourist visas. Tourist visas were only supposed to be valid for short-term stay. But in effect, Batista had given his approval to putting up these tourists for an indefinite period, partly to earn American goodwill and partly because they or their sponsors were paying hefty fees. As the St. Louis ship sailed in May of 1939, there was a backlash in Cuba. The Cuban government changed its policy. The president of Cuba didn't like what Batista had done and perhaps wasn't getting his cut. And so the ship was not allowed to land in Cuba. There were negotiations between Jewish organizations and the Cuban government with the State Department trying to facilitate things. While the negotiations proceeded, the captain of the ship sailed around kind of aimlessly because he didn't want to take the passengers back to Germany. The Coast Guard began to follow the ship. The press began to cover the story. It was a kind of sensation of the day. The passengers got the impression that the Coast Guard was trying to prevent them from landing in the United States. Some of those passengers are still alive. They were children at the time, and they still believe this. There was then no such thing as political asylum. That didn't come about until the 1950s. The passengers had visas to Cuba. They did not have visas to the United States. If the ship had landed in an American port, they would not have been allowed in. There were telegrams to the White House. Please do something about the passengers of the St. Louis. Roosevelt had tried once before to stretch the quotas. Immediately after the night of broken glass, Roosevelt held a press conference in which he said there were 10,000 to 15,000 German and Austrian Jews in the United States on visitors' visas. Visitors' visas were temporary. He was announcing he was not going to send them back. He took flack in Congress for that announcement. Moreover, he had an additional problem, a bigger problem, in May or June of 1939. His biggest priority then was to get Congress to modify the Neutrality Acts, which would have barred the United States from supplying aid or military, even selling military goods to any party involved in a war. So if Britain and France went to war with Nazi Germany, the United States would not be able to help, even economically. Roosevelt wanted that changed. He needed the votes of Republicans and Southern Democrats, most of whom were vehemently anti-immigrant and some of whom were anti-Semitic. He was not going to let in 900 plus passengers to the United States illegally and ruin his chance of getting Congress to modify the Neutrality Acts. The Coast Guard, I said, was following the ship. The Coast Guard was following the ship in part because the Coast Guard commander got a call from Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, who was Jewish, asking the Coast Guard commander to follow the ship. He said, negotiations are underway. We need to be able to direct the ship to the right place. So please follow the ship, but don't tell anybody that I'm involved. We have the transcript of that phone conversation in the Morgenthau papers. So the negotiations in Cuba failed. The negotiations in Europe succeeded. And Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, all democracies, took in all of the passengers of the SS St. Louis, except for 22, who had Cuban immigration visas and were allowed into Havana. None of the passengers went back to Germany. This was June 1939. There was no war yet. There was no Holocaust yet. There were no gas chambers yet. Of course, we know what happened later. Nazi Germany conquered Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. And some of those passengers were swept up and deported. But even so, the early accounts of the numbers are way, way off if you've read Voyage of the Damned or seen the Hollywood movie. You get the impression that most of the passengers died. 2 staff members at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum have done an excruciatingly careful reconstruction of what happened to each person on that ship. And we know today that more than 2/3 of the passengers survived. And in fact, about half ultimately immigrated to the United States. So that's the real story, not the myth of the SS St. Louis. I'm perfectly willing to say you can blame Franklin Roosevelt for refusing to take a humanitarian act resulting in the death of about 300 people. But if you do that, it seems to me you have to look at the other side and say that but for Franklin Roosevelt, the 5,000 to 6,000 who made it to Cuba never would have been able to do that. So this is a slice of the second Franklin Roosevelt. I've probably gone about as far as I should with a direct presentation because I know on this topic people always have questions. I know that people have strong feelings on the subject. So thank you very much for coming.
I have the impression that Cordell Hull was largely responsible for the State Department action.
For those who couldn't hear, the question was about what about Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State? Cordell Hull was not a very good Secretary of State. He was a politician who came in. He was very tentative in imposing his will on the State Department. And he was sick a lot, too. Wills was more liberal than Hull, and Wills was more liberal than most of the career people in the State Department and in the Foreign Service. So as long as Roosevelt could use Wills to kind of get his way around the State Department, things didn't move too badly. But when Wills began to get into trouble too, he had his own private issues, kind of personal scandal involving homosexuality, which was then a scandal. Then the State Department, the kind of middle ranks, could do whatever they wanted to do. And there were a good number of anti-Semites in the State Department, and there were a good number of people who were not anti-Semitic, but figured the United States had no business intervening on behalf of European Jews. The United States had enough problems of its own. So Hall didn't really challenge that, and he didn't really preside effectively over the State Department.
But could you briefly say something about when the administration, the Roosevelt administration, became aware of what was happening?
I've just been asked to give the lecture I gave at the University of Vermont, which I won't do. I guess I'll say the following. If you're looking for timing, the critical dates are from about September 1942 until December 1942. If you're looking for results, Roosevelt said privately that the State Department investigation confirmed the thrust of a telegram sent out from Switzerland by Gerhard Riedner that Nazi Germany was looking to exterminate 3.5 to 4 million Jews by using poison gas. So he accepted the thrust of the information. He was asked to make a statement, a public statement, and he did in a sense. That is, the United States and the British persuaded the Allied governments to issue a statement on December 17, 1942, which for the first time announced that Nazi Germany had a policy of exterminating the Jewish people in Europe. But that was kind of, he avoided a unilateral American statement, and he avoided a presidential statement. And I tried in Burlington to explain what he was worried about, but that would take a much longer explanation. And I don't agree with his reticence on that occasion, but I don't think you should view it as a sign of complete indifference or hostility. I think he had his reasons, I just don't think they were good enough.
But it seems to me that anybody who had read Mein Kampf would know what was in store.
Roosevelt actually did read Mein Kampf. In fact, he knew enough to say that the English edition was an abridged edition that had cut out some of the worst stuff. He had read some of it in German. The question is always, why didn't people react more? And part of this is intellectual, but part of this is it's very hard to convince people in advance of disaster that they should take very difficult steps when you can't prove that there's going to be a disaster. When you have genocide in progress, people scream that the world should react. But sometimes it's in the midst of a war. And in this case, a war for the survival of Western civilization. And then it's very hard to react. But getting people to react before there's disaster, when there are only signs of disaster, is very difficult. Just to go through the basics. The Neutrality Acts prevented Roosevelt from doing much in Europe in the 1930s. Congress consistently cut the administration's military requests. In 1940, Belgium had a larger and stronger army than the United States. That's the starting point. So when you think about what might be done to stop the Holocaust. Don't think of the United States today with missiles and smart bombs and the one world superpower. Think of the United States of 1940. Which had to kind of build to the point where it might conceivably do something. And the outcome of the war was very uncertain until the second half of 1943. A lot of people thought the Axis was winning.
I just want to point out one of the many flaws of the quota system of the time.
You're quite correct that the quota system had a huge range of injustices. Countries sometimes decide that they can't take in all that many immigrants, but you had an overall total of 153,000. Britain was given a quota of 65,000, which it hardly ever used. Germany was given a quota of 25,957. Austria was given a quota of 1,413. Poland, I don't remember, but it's a tiny quota. Romania had a tiny quota. So the whole system was an unfair system. It was a system based on racial prejudices. And it was passed by Congress in the 1920s. And every time anyone, including some of the Jewish organizations, raised the idea of going in and trying to get Congress to modify the quotas, the answer they got was, Congress will make things worse. Congress will cut the quotas. So, this is one of the great injustices that looks to be, even in retrospect, politically impossible to take care of. Even if Franklin Roosevelt had used all of his political capital in 1939 to try to get an expansion of the quotas, it would not have done any good. It would not have persuaded Congress to modify the quotas. The real problem was that before 1938, the quotas were not filled, and after 1940, the quotas were not filled because of new regulations. That's the third Roosevelt.
I know that a number of Jews moved to Australia. How many Jews potentially could have immigrated there?
The question was about Australia as a haven, and it was not much of a haven in the critical time period from 1938 to 1941. Australia was very restrictionist and discriminatory against Jewish applicants. Of course, there was land. There was a lot of vacant land, but it was not open to Jewish immigrants. The one place that really took people without visas was Shanghai, and some people were desperate enough to just take their chances in Shanghai.
You said there were three Roosevelts. You spoke about the second, third. What was the first?
Okay, I'm being asked now to summarize in a few words our thesis in the whole book. I hope you'll actually read the book. But the first Roosevelt was the first-term Roosevelt. And he was a Roosevelt who didn't like Hitler and who was worried about what Germany was doing. But he didn't do anything publicly. He just had other priorities. The country was in desperate shape economically and socially, and he was trying to pull the country out of the Depression and save democracy. And, he still receives a lot of credit for that. Roosevelt is, in all surveys of historians, Roosevelt is ranked in the top three of American presidents on the grounds that he dealt with such terrible problems and succeeded more than he failed. So that was the first Roosevelt. You could, if you want to call him a bystander to Nazi persecution, that's not really a distortion. He said some things behind the scenes, and he made very critical comments, but he didn't do much in public. The second Roosevelt is the one I described. The third Roosevelt is the one who didn't want to single Jews out during the war and the early phase of the Holocaust. And the fourth Roosevelt is the one who, under the influence of Secretary Morgenthau, was persuaded that the State Department had botched refugee policy and established a new government agency to take jurisdiction, and that was the War Refugee Board, which was established in January of 1944. The last year and a half of the war, we estimate that the War Refugee Board helped to save about 200,000 people, which again is not nearly as large as the casualties, but is a pretty substantial number.
In 1943, 1944, when the Allies were winning the war, why did the Allies refuse to bomb the railroad tracks at that point?
The question is about refusal to bomb gas chambers, crematoria, and rail lines. And this is equally popular question with the story of the SS St. Louis. These are kind of the two emblematic events that people use to illustrate American indifference or hostility. I don't think either one works in quite that way, but it's worth talking about. So I mentioned the War Refugee Board. The War Refugee Board was established in January of 1944. In June 1944, requests came in to the board to bomb rail lines and gas chambers and crematoria. Note the date. This is June 1944. First of all, the only extermination camp still operating was Auschwitz. The others had already been shut down. Secondly, the Allies had only recently got the capacity to reach Auschwitz by bomber from an air base in Italy, which they were gradually conquering. It was too far to fly safely from Britain and back. So all of the bombing done in Silesia, the area, the region in which Auschwitz was located, was done from the 8th Air Force in Italy. The War Refugee Board investigated bombing the rail lines and found that the Germans were repairing damage to rail lines within a day, sometimes within hours. They weren't going to ask for American planes and pilots to risk their lives to do something that wasn't going to do anybody much good. Bombing the gas chambers and the crematoria was a different matter. And there was a staff member of the War Refugee Board who was in favor of it and pushed it. And so the director of the War Refugee Board, John Pele, wrote a very cautiously worded memo saying, you know, we've had reports of these terrible things at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and isn't investigating this something that the War Department might want to consider? The Assistant Secretary of War was a man by the name of John J. McCloy. McCloy did not think this was proper use of military resources and said so very bluntly and almost immediately. Nobody did a detailed investigation of the feasibility, the logistics, the likelihood of success. It was rejected very quickly, very firmly. The operations people in the War Department were even more vehement and private than McCloy was in responding to the War Refugee Board. We learned later that the 8th Air Force was bombing industrial targets in Silesia, and they could have tried. We don't know whether they would have succeeded, This is not smart bombs. We don't know whether they would have succeeded, and they might have killed prisoners. But they could have tried. And McCloy said no. McCloy's biographer says, the proposal never went any higher. McCloy rejected it in late June, he rejected it in September, he rejected it again in October. The Secretary of War, McCloy's boss, Stimson, kept a diary, kept a detailed appointment book. There's no sign that it ever reached Stimson. We looked very hard for any evidence that it reached Roosevelt. We found nothing. So it looks as though it ended with McCloy. I mean, I personally think it would have been a good thing to try. But if you look at the documents from 1944, there were no rallies saying bomb Auschwitz. There were no newspaper articles saying bomb Auschwitz. In meetings between Jewish leaders and the president, no one raised the issue of bombing Auschwitz. This is one of those things where relatively few people had the detailed knowledge to realize that this could have been done without stretching military resources too far. In retrospect, it looks like a missed opportunity.
What influence did Eleanor have in this, or was she just involved in it?
The question was about Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt continues to have legions of admirers, and I'm afraid on this topic we usually disappoint them. Eleanor Roosevelt grew up in an anti-Semitic family. If you look at her letters, even as early in her marriage to Franklin, she was frequently complaining about pushy Jews wearing furs and other unflattering stereotypes. She eventually grew out of it, but she was never a leader on Jewish issues. On children, yes. She lobbied for the Wagner-Rogers bill to let in 20,000 German Jewish children outside the quota. She hated the State Department. But most of her personal efforts came on behalf of left-wing intellectuals who were persecuted by the Nazis rather than Jews. She wrote a daily newspaper column. She never mentioned Nazi persecution of the Jews until 1943. And even then she said, I don't know what we can do about it except win the war as quickly as possible. And that was also the view of the State Department and the War Department. Okay, thank you all very much.